The wind howled through the empty streets, its icy breath biting through the darkness. Snow, whipped into frenzied gusts, lashed against the ground and swirled in eerie patterns under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was a night that seemed to suffocate the world, pressing the air down with the weight of the storm. The usual noise of the city had been swallowed whole, leaving behind only the cruel, unyielding silence of a winter that would not let go. Daniel Carter stood in his kitchen, his gaze distant as he waited for the microwave to finish reheating his dinner. He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw absently, his thoughts adrift in the stillness. The wind battered the windows, a constant reminder of the unrelenting storm outside. He had always hated winter. The cold crept into his bones, no matter how many layers he wrapped himself in. On nights like this, the emptiness of his house seemed to echo louder. The walls, once filled with warmth and the bustle of family, were now silent. The laughter and voices that once made the space feel alive had long since faded, leaving behind an aching void. As he waited, the sound of the microwave's hum barely registered in his mind. But then, out of the stillness, came a sharp sound. A series of 3 rapid knocks on the door. Daniel froze. He hadn't been expecting anyone. In this part of the city, especially on a night like this, visitors were as rare as a break in the storm. His neighbors weren't exactly the type to drop by, and he had no family or friends left who might show up unannounced. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But something about the way the knocks echoed in the quiet of his home hollow, urgent, pulled at something deep inside him. A cold knot formed in his stomach, a tightening that wouldn't let go. Reluctantly, he made his way to the door, each step heavier than the last. His hand hesitated on the doorknob for a split second, but then he turned it, pulling the door open. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. Snow had piled up on the doorstep, the soft white blanket concealing something small. Nestled within the snow was a bundle of fabric, its edges frayed and dirty from the harsh weather. But it wasn't just a bundle, it was shifting. Something inside it moved, stirred, and then golden eyes blinked open. The eyes locked onto his, and Daniel's heart seemed to skip a beat. A whimper, barely audible, escaped the tiny creature. His breath caught in his chest as his mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. A baby, but not human. The tiny form in the snow was fragile, its skin a deep, dusky blue, a stark contrast against the white snow. Its small hands were tipped with delicate claws, and a faint, ethereal glow clung to its skin, shimmering faintly in the dim porch light. It looked so impossibly fragile, like a creature from another world. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His mind raced, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the reality he knew. But then, his gaze drifted upward, drawn to the figure standing just beyond the porch. She was half hidden in the swirling snow, her tall silhouette standing out against the storm. Even hunched over in exhaustion, she was striking. Easily taller than Daniel. Her long black hair clung to her face, wet with melted snow, and her features, while beautiful, were marred by something much deeper than mere cold. There was fear in her eyes, desperation that seemed to seep from her very being. Hunger not just for food, but for something far more elusive, safety. She was Valari. Daniel had heard of them, of course. The Valari were an alien race. Refugees left stranded on Earth after the war. The war that had ended years ago, but whose scars had never truly healed. The Valari had once been a powerful race. Scholars, warriors, travelers of the stars. But that was before their homeworld had been destroyed. Before their fleets were shattered. Before they had been scattered to the corners of the universe, unwanted and abandoned, slowly fading into extinction. The baby let out another soft, plaintive cry, pulling Daniel back to the present. His eyes snapped back down to the tiny form in his hands. The weight of the situation settled in his chest. She had left it here, on his doorstep, and the thought hit him hard. Had she been turned away so many times before? How many other doors had she knocked on, only to be met with indifference, cruelty, or even fear? How many nights had she spent wandering in the storm, begging for help, only to be rejected again and again? Daniel's stomach twisted painfully at the thought. He looked back at her, this time seeing the full extent of her exhaustion, the way her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of whatever burden she carried. Her eyes, wide with fear and desperation, seemed to pierce through him, begging for something, anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. As the wind howled around them, Daniel knew this moment would change everything. This tiny, fragile creature and the woman standing in the storm had found him. Whether by fate or chance, they had arrived at his doorstep, and there was no turning away now. The world outside may have been a frozen wasteland, but within the walls of his home there was warmth, and with it, a chance to make a difference. Or to turn his back on them, as so many had before. The choice was his. The storm outside seemed to intensify with each passing moment, the wind howling like a living thing, clawing at the walls of the house as if it, too, were desperate to get in. Daniel stood motionless for a long moment, watching the woman, his mind grappling with the enormity of the situation. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to turn her away, to protect himself from whatever danger she might represent. But then he remembered the baby, the fragile, tiny life he held in his arms. That's what made the difference. He had only been planning on a quiet night. He hadn't been prepared for any of this. But how could he turn away from them now, when they needed him more than anyone ever had? The question of what he should do next felt like an impossible choice, one he couldn't ignore any longer. The woman, Valari, he reminded himself, sat frozen on the couch, her golden eyes darting warily around the room. She looked exhausted, her body trembling with a combination of cold and fear, and Daniel couldn't help but notice how tightly she clutched the edges of her tattered clothing, as if trying to hold herself together. She was barely holding on, just like the child she had so carefully left in his arms. There was something about her, something that spoke of a kind of unspoken pain, of survival against all odds. She hadn't just been running from the storm. She had been running from something much worse. He heard her soft, steady breathing as she slowly relaxed into the couch, but it wasn't a peaceful relaxation. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. Her gaunt face, the dark rings beneath her eyes, the pallor of her skin, everything about her screamed that she hadn't had a restful night in ages. How long had she been out there? How many other doors had she knocked on, only to be met with silence, rejection, or worse? He could only imagine the kind of hopelessness that had driven her to knock on his door, to trust a complete stranger with her most precious possession. The baby's soft whimper interrupted his thoughts. It nuzzled against his chest, still nestled in the blankets, its tiny form so fragile and warm. It had stopped crying, but its little hands were still opening and closing, its body instinctively seeking the warmth it so desperately needed. Daniel adjusted his grip, holding it closer, feeling its heart beat softly against his. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget everything else, the world outside, the uncertainty of what he was doing, because this little being was alive, and he was the one who could help it. He walked back toward the kitchen, leaving the woman to herself for a moment, but not without a glance back. Her eyes, still locked on the baby, were full of something deep, something that made Daniel pause. She wasn't just watching her child, she was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move, to show that he wasn't going to betray the trust she had so hesitantly placed in him. The kitchen was chaotic, half-used ingredients littered the counters, old dishes piled up in the sink, and the faint smell of yesterday's dinner still lingered in the air. Daniel didn't care. None of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting food into their stomachs and offering them a moment of warmth. He fumbled with a can of soup, twisting off the lid with one hand while the other adjusted the baby in his arms. The baby's tiny, fragile form felt so light, like a bird in his hands. As he poured the soup into a pot, the steam rising from it seemed to offer a temporary comfort, the warmth of it almost too much for the cold air surrounding them. But he didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it, almost greedily. The woman had remained silent since he last spoke to her, but he could see her shoulders slowly relax as the warmth of the house began to sink in. The door was closed behind them, but Daniel knew she wasn't safe yet. The storm outside wasn't the only threat. There was something much darker hanging over her, a history of pain and rejection that had led her here, to this moment. He turned his attention back to the soup, stirring it absently as he tried to formulate a plan. The situation was so far beyond what he could have expected. He wasn't equipped to handle this. He wasn't trained to help people in these kinds of situations, but he was all they had now. The baby shifted again, its tiny hands reaching out instinctively for its mother, and Daniel carefully placed it back down on the couch, nestling it close to the woman. She let out a soft, shaky breath when the baby settled beside her, her hand hovering over the tiny creature as if to make sure it was still there, still safe. "I'm not going to hurt you," Daniel said again, this time more to himself than to her. But she didn't seem to hear him. Her focus was entirely on the baby, her brow furrowed with worry as she gently rocked the little one back and forth, whispering words in a language Daniel didn't understand. He watched her for a long moment, his mind racing. He wanted to help, but how? What was he supposed to do? He wasn't a therapist, he wasn't a medical professional. Hell, he barely knew how to cook properly. But at that moment, none of those things mattered. What mattered was that this woman and her child were in his home, in his care, and it was his responsibility to make sure they survived the night, perhaps more than just the night. As the soup simmered on the stove, Daniel finally turned toward her, holding out the bowl of hot soup. "You need to eat," he said gently, his voice calm but firm. "It'll help, both of you." The woman hesitated for a long time, staring at the bowl as if it were some kind of test. Then, slowly, she took it from him, her hands trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. For a moment, she just stared at it, the weight of her pride warring with the urgency of her hunger. But finally, she took a sip, her eyes closing in relief as the warmth of the soup touched her insides. Daniel let out a quiet sigh of relief. He didn't know if the food would help heal the deep, unseen wound she carried, but it was something. And for now, it was all he could offer. He stepped back, letting her eat in peace, and went to sit in the corner of the room, his own thoughts swirling. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, for the first time that night, it felt like the world had paused. And for a brief moment, just a brief moment, everything felt manageable. To hope, too. He stood there, his feet rooted to the floor, watching as she moved with careful precision, cradling the tiny child in her arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. There was a quiet reverence in her touch, a tenderness that spoke volumes about the bond between them, about what it meant to be a mother in a world that had taken so much from her. For a moment, Daniel simply watched her, feeling the weight of the quiet in the room. There was no need for words right now. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew what the other was thinking. There was nothing more to be done, no more barriers left to cross. Trey had let her guard down just enough to let him in, and now he had to honor that trust, even if it was fragile and new. Trey looked back at him, her golden eyes meeting his for a brief moment. It was like she was seeing him for the first time. Not just the man who had opened his door, but the one who had given her something she hadn't had in far too long. Safety. She looked at him as if trying to understand him, trying to read his intentions in the depth of his eyes. There was still a distance between them, one that couldn't be bridged by a meal or a few words of comfort, but it was a step forward, and that was enough. She turned back to the baby, and with slow, deliberate movements she adjusted her grip, shifting the little one against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers curled around her clothing, instinctively searching for warmth and comfort. Trey hummed softly to her child, a low, melodic sound in the Valari language, a song of solace, of protection, of love. It was a song that spoke of things far older than time, a language as ancient as the stars, and for a moment, Daniel felt like an intruder in that sacred space. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, and he could see how deeply it meant to her. She wasn't just feeding her child, she was giving her the one thing that had been taken from her long ago, dignity. But despite the peace in the room, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of kindness, this shelter he had offered, was not enough to undo the years of suffering they had both endured. Trey had been through too much, too many nights spent in cold silence, knocking on doors that would never open for her. Daniel could see that now, in the way she carried herself, the way her eyes darted about, still filled with wariness and caution. She was so accustomed to fear that it had become part of her, ingrained in the very fabric of her being. He glanced out the window again, where the storm continued to rage, thick and relentless. It was as though the world outside had conspired to mirror the storm that raged inside Trey, her own internal conflict, her struggles with trust, survival, and vulnerability. The snow was a constant reminder that the world didn't care for the weak, didn't offer refuge to those who needed it most. Yet, somehow, tonight had been different. Tonight, Daniel had opened his door, and Trey had Stepa. Her gaze moved between Daniel and the sleeping infant, and there was something in her eyes, something hopeful, but still guarded. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered, so softly that Daniel almost didn't catch it. Her voice was raw, fragile, as if the words were something that had been locked inside her for too long. "I didn't know if anyone would help me. I thought—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head slightly, as if she couldn't finish the thought. Daniel felt his heart clench at her words. He knew that feeling. The overwhelming weight of uncertainty. The fear that no one would answer your call, that no one would be there when you needed them most. He had been there, in his own way, hiding in his solitude, afraid of reaching out, afraid of asking for help. "You don't have to explain," he said, his voice gentle. He meant it. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, how it felt to be completely alone in the world, with no one to trust, no one to turn to. But he was here now, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Trey didn't speak again, but the silence between them felt different now. It wasn't heavy with distrust or fear. It was the quiet of two people, broken in their own ways, but willing to try. Willing to make the most of what they had, however small that might be. The baby slept soundly in her arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with each gentle breath. For the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to relax. The storm outside was still raging, but inside there was warmth. There was peace. And for tonight, that was enough. First time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of purpose that wasn't rooted in the cold solitude he had built for himself. For so long, he had withdrawn from the world, creating walls around him to avoid the messiness of human connection. He had chosen isolation because it was easier, safer. But now, with Trey and her child in his home, everything felt different. The weight of his quiet life, the stillness he had surrounded himself with, suddenly felt out of place. As Trey stepped toward the room, her movements slow and deliberate, Daniel watched her, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her shoulders still held that slight tension, as if she wasn't entirely convinced that the safety he offered was real. She wasn't just physically tired, there was something deeper, something more painful. The weight of everything she had endured was still there, hanging over her like a shadow she couldn't shake off. She stopped at the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, looking back at him again. Her eyes, once so guarded, were different now, softer, more open, but still carrying the weight of the world. There was a flicker of vulnerability in them, something Daniel hadn't seen when she first arrived. And despite the wall she had built around herself, despite the wariness that still lingered, she had allowed herself this small moment of trust. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Are you sure?" Her voice was quiet, but there was an earnestness in it, a need for reassurance. She wasn't just asking about the room, about the offer he had made. She was asking about everything, whether he meant it, whether he would follow through. Daniel nodded slowly, his heart heavier than before. "Yes, I'm sure. You don't have to go anywhere. You're safe here." For a long moment, Trey didn't move, just stood there, her golden eyes scanning him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she was trying to see through all the layers he had hidden behind. Finally, she stepped into the room, but before she closed the door behind her, she turned to him once more. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so small, so fragile, that it hit him harder than any words of gratitude he had ever heard. It wasn't just for the meal, for the shelter, or even for the clothes he had given her. It was for seeing her, for offering her something she had probably long forgotten existed: kindness, safety, a space where she could just breathe. He didn't say anything else, just nodded, unable to speak for the lump that had formed in his throat. The simple words felt so inadequate, so small in the face of what she had gone through, but it was all he could offer. He watched her disappear into the room, the door clicking softly behind her, leaving him standing in the hallway, alone with his thoughts. For a moment, the house felt emptier than it had before, even though it was full of people now. The silence that followed was heavy, but not in the same suffocating way it had been before. It was the silence of a house filled with possibilities, filled with unspoken promises, the kind of silence that felt like a new beginning, even though it had been forged through pain and hardship. Daniel turned away from the door, his eyes lingering on the faint outline of Trey's figure through the cracked door, before he walked back toward the kitchen. The faint smell of coffee still lingered in the air, mixing with the warmth of the house. He had offered her a place to stay, but in doing so, he had also given himself something. The truth was, he wasn't just helping her, he was helping himself too. He wasn't sure how things would unfold from here. He didn't know how long Trey would stay, or how long it would take before she started to truly heal. But he knew this. He had opened a door to something more, something that wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, about offering a little piece of humanity in a world that had so often stripped it away. And as he sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the quiet morning light spilling through the curtains, he realized that maybe this small, fragile connection was what he had been missing all along. For years he had lived in a house full of ghosts, and now he was sharing it with someone who needed him. For the first time in ages, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone in the world, and in that moment the house didn't feel so empty anymore. Trey had stayed, and in doing so she had given him something he hadn't realized he had been craving: purpose, connection, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was hope left in the world. As he finished his coffee, Daniel allowed himself to believe it just for a moment that this was the beginning of something different, something better, and that, perhaps, together, they could both heal walls that had been his fortress for so long, keeping everyone at a distance, keeping the pain locked away where it couldn't overwhelm him. He had learned, over time, that survival meant burying the hurt deep down, hiding it from the world, pretending it didn't exist. But in that moment, sitting across from Trey, he realized how fragile those walls were, how much they had kept him isolated, kept him from feeling, from connecting with others. And maybe that was the biggest loss of all. He had stopped living for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly be present with another person. Trey's words hung in the air between them, resonating in a way that made Daniel pause. She was right. They had both been fighting for so long, fighting just to survive, just to get by, that it had become second nature. It had become their default mode. Keep moving, keep pushing, don't stop. Don't let yourself feel the weight of everything you've lost, everything you've been through. But now, as he sat there in the quiet of his kitchen, with Trey and her child sitting just a few feet away, he realized how much that fight had cost him. It wasn't just the loss of people, of things, of everything he had once known. It was the loss of himself, the parts of him that had once known how to connect, how to trust, how to be vulnerable. The parts that had been buried, suffocated beneath the weight of his own grief. Trey took a deep breath, her eyes now fixed on her child, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremble in her hands as she cradled the baby. She was still carrying so much more than he could even begin to understand. But in that small, fragile touch she had offered him, in that brief moment of connection, he saw something he hadn't expected: hope. Not the kind of hope that came with grand promises or sweeping changes, but the kind of hope that was born from shared pain, from understanding the weight of each other's experiences, from knowing that despite everything they had been through, they weren't alone. "I've been running for so long," Trey murmured, almost to herself, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to trust that anything good could last." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. He wanted to say something that would take away her fear, that would offer her the reassurance she so clearly needed, but he couldn't promise her anything. He didn't have that power. All he had was the present moment, and right now, that was enough. "You don't have to run anymore," Daniel said softly, his voice steady, though his heart raced with the truth of the words. "You don't have to fight alone." Trey's gaze flickered up to meet his then, and for a brief moment there was no suspicion in her eyes, no wariness, just a quiet understanding. She seemed to consider his words, let them settle in her mind, before she slowly nodded. It wasn't a full surrender, but it was something more than she had given before. It was the first time she had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. She could trust this moment. The baby let out another soft sound, her tiny hand reaching up as if instinctively searching for comfort. Trey's focus shifted back to the little one, her expression softening, her features relaxing as she gently rocked the child in her arms. The movement was instinctive, soothing, and for a moment Daniel watched her, marveling at the way she had become completely, absorbed in the act of mothering. There was something sacred in the way she held her child, something that made the whole world seem to slow down. Daniel wasn't sure when it happened, but as he watched her, he realized that the air between them had changed. The tension had eased, the walls had cracked, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel so isolated. He wasn't sure if Trey felt the same way, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They were both here, and that was enough. "I'm not sure how to do this," Trey said suddenly, her voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. How to stop running, how to trust someone again. Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew the road to healing wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, and there would be times when the past would claw its way back to the surface. But in this small, quiet space, with the soft rhythm of a child's breathing in the background and the warmth of the room filling the cold edges of his heart, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something different. "You don't have to have all the answers," he said, his voice more certain than he felt. "I don't either, but we can figure it out together." Trey looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, something passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness or understanding, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. Something fragile, something tentative, but real. It was a shared understanding that they both had a long way to go before they could fully trust, before they could allow themselves to heal. But for the first time, they were no longer alone in that journey. "I'll try," Trey whispered, her voice small but determined. "I'll try." Daniel nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. It was a promise, even if it wasn't a perfect one. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. They could be better. Together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house was still quiet, the morning light creeping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The only sound was the soft breathing of the baby in Trey's arms, a quiet reminder of how fragile life could be, how precious the moments of peace were. And in that silence, in that shared space, Daniel realized that maybe this simple, fleeting connection was the beginning of something more. Something that had been waiting to break through the walls they had built. Something that was worth fighting for, even if it was just a chance to heal, to trust, to live again. The future was still uncertain, still filled with questions, but for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a spark of hope flicker within him. For a moment, the weight of their words hung in the air, filling the space with a strange sense of calm. It was almost as though the storm outside had finally found its way into the house. Slowly, but surely, it was becoming something they could manage, something they could hold on to. Trey stood there, her gaze not fully on him, but not entirely off either. Her fingers gently adjusted the blanket around Ravi's tiny body, smoothing out the wrinkles, her actions meticulous, as though she were trying to find some sense of control in a world that had been turned upside down. Daniel could see the exhaustion in her movements, in the slight tremble of her hands, but there was something else there now, too. It wasn't just the weight of fear and survival. It was something more subtle, more fragile. She was letting herself hope. She had been running for so long, for so many years, that the idea of a safe place, of a life free from the constant threat of violence and persecution, felt almost out of reach. But in that moment, looking at him, she seemed to grasp at it like a lifeline. "I'm not used to..." She trailed off, her voice cracking slightly. She swallowed hard, clearly trying to gather herself before speaking. To this, to people offering help without expecting something in return. Daniel's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her words, It was a sharp reminder of everything she had endured, the walls she had built around herself out of necessity, the isolation she had forced herself into to survive. It wasn't just the war or the violence, it was the betrayal, the rejection, the constant reminder that she wasn't wanted. No one had offered her help without an agenda, without a hidden cost. "You don't have to get used to it," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. He stepped closer, careful not to make any sudden movements that might cause her to pull away. "You don't have to earn it. It's just how things should be." Trey didn't say anything in response, but her gaze softened as she looked down at her daughter. The baby, still nestled securely against her chest, let out a quiet coo, her tiny hand reaching out in her sleep. Trey's face, though still drawn with exhaustion, seemed to ease just a little. There was a flicker of peace, however brief, in the way she held Ravi, the way her body seemed to relax with the child in her arms. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching her, and for the first time in days he allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of peace, too. He wasn't a savior, he wasn't doing anything extraordinary, but in the stillness of the room, with the weight of the world pressing down on them, he had given her something simple but vital: safety, and for now, that was enough. Trey shifted slightly, rocking Ravi gently as the baby began to stir. She looked up at him again, and for a second their eyes locked, long enough for Daniel to see the conflict there, the fear of relying on someone else, the hesitation of trusting in something that might be temporary, something that could disappear in an instant. He could see it in the way her golden eyes flickered with doubt, but also something else. Something that reminded him of the first time he had opened the door to her, the first time he had offered her shelter from the storm. "What happens next?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question wasn't just about today or tomorrow. It was about the future, about what came after this fragile moment of peace. She was asking, in her own way, how long they could stay hidden, how long they could live in this borrowed safety before the outside world came crashing in again. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He had been asking himself that very same question. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew she didn't expect him to, but there was one thing he did know, and he held on to it as tightly as he could, like a shield against the uncertainty. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm not going to let them take you. Not Ravi, not either of you." Trey's expression softened, but the doubt still lingered behind her eyes. She didn't fully believe him, not yet. She had been let down too many times before, but there was something in his voice, something she hadn't heard before. A promise, quiet but unwavering. And for a moment, she seemed to let herself believe it. To believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rest, to stop running. The quiet stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't filled with dread. It wasn't filled with the heavy weight of uncertainty. Instead, it was filled with a kind of tentative hope, the kind that flickers in the dark, refusing to be snuffed out no matter how hard the winds blow. Trey carefully shifted Ravi, who had begun to fall asleep again, and gently placed her on the couch, adjusting the blanket around her. The baby let out a soft sigh, her tiny body relaxing into the warmth of her mother's care. Trey looked up at Daniel again, her expression still wary, but now softened by something else, a kind of quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more conviction, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "For this, for not turning me away." Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." He took a step closer, his voice low. "You don't have to fight this alone anymore." For a long moment they just stood there looking at each other. Neither of them had all the answers, and neither of them knew what the future would hold. But in that moment, surrounded by the soft warmth of the house, the quiet breath of a baby asleep on the couch, they were no longer alone. Trey turned back to her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from Ravi's forehead as she whispered softly in Valari, the ancient language carrying a kind of tenderness Daniel couldn't quite understand. But he didn't need to. The love in her voice, the devotion in the way she held her child, spoke volumes without a single word. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, Daniel knew that no matter what came next, they had found something worth fighting for. It wasn't just survival, it was hope. It was the possibility of something more than the fear and the pain they had both carried for so long. It was the chance to stop running, the chance to rest, the chance to heal. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel believed in it too. The warmth of the moment lingered in the air as the sun continued its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The quiet hum of the world around them, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant chirp of birds created a peaceful rhythm that seemed to synchronize with Daniel's heartbeat. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on him. There were no shadows in the alleyways, no footsteps echoing behind him, no constant vigilance keeping him on edge. In the serene stillness of this new life, it felt as if the relentless noise of fear and survival had finally faded into the background. Trey sat on the blanket beside Ravi, her fingers gently brushing through the grass, her golden eyes soft as she watched her child explore the small patch of earth before her. Ravi's small fingers reached out, her face filled with innocent wonder as she grasped at the world around her. She was growing so fast, Daniel realized stronger, more curious, more alive with each passing day. She was no longer the fragile, tiny infant he had first cradled in his arms, her body so small and vulnerable in the cold of that night. She was now a little person, full of energy and life, babbling away, exploring the world in her own way. It was a small but profound transformation, one that Daniel had watched with a quiet sense of pride, though he knew it wasn't his to claim. It was Trey's strength, her determination to care for her daughter, that had brought them here to this moment. But Daniel was part of it now. He had helped create this moment, this space where they could be safe, where they could rest. As Trey sat there, her body relaxed for the first time in months, Daniel found himself marveling at the quiet beauty of the scene before him. He could see the traces of her past in her, the layers of war and hardship that had been etched into her features, the guardedness in her eyes that never quite disappeared. But today, there was something different. Today, the weight of her past didn't define her. For the first time since he had met her, Trey wasn't just surviving. She was living. Her laughter, when it came, was soft, unburdened by the exhaustion and fear that had once clung to it like a shadow. She laughed as Ravi tried to crawl toward a small patch of wildflowers, her tiny hands reaching for the bright colors in her path. The baby's giggles were infectious, and Daniel couldn't help but chuckle along with her. It was as though the world had slowed down, and in that moment everything was right. They were here, together, and nothing else mattered. Trey turned her attention back to her daughter, her fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from Ravi's forehead. Her eyes softened with affection, the kind of tenderness Daniel hadn't seen in her since they first crossed paths. Her expression was filled with something he hadn't fully seen before: peace. It was as if, for the first time, she had allowed herself to feel it, allowed herself to let go. The fear that had always been present, that silent tension in her body, was gone. It was the beginning of something new for her, and in many ways for him too. Daniel leaned back against the railing of the deck, taking in the scenery around him. The settlement stretched out before him, nestled between gently rolling hills. The soft violet hues of the sky reflected the tranquility of the place, and in the distance he could see the small cluster of homes, each with its own patch of garden, each with its own story. Here, there were no military patrols, no angry stares or whispered threats. Here, they were just people. People who had come to start over, to rebuild, to live without fear of being hunted. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough, and it was theirs. Trey's voice broke the quiet, drawing Daniel's attention back to her. She had stopped playing with Ravi for a moment, her eyes fixed on something far off, her expression unreadable. "Do you think this is real?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. Daniel furrowed his brow slightly, unsure of what she meant at first. But then he saw it in her eyes, an uncertainty that had been buried so deep in her for so long. The fear of letting herself believe in something better, something that might not last. The fear of hoping again, only to have that hope ripped away. "I think it's as real as we make it," he replied, his voice steady. He wanted to offer more, but he knew the truth of it. Life wasn't certain, but they had created something here, something real. "We're here, and we're not going anywhere." Trey's eyes softened at his words, and for a moment she seemed to search his face, as if trying to read him, to gauge whether or not she could believe him. She had been so used to fighting alone, so used to living in a world where hope was a fragile thing that could break at any moment. But in that brief moment, her expression softened just enough for Daniel to see that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe in the possibility of something different. The soft sound of Ravi's giggles filled the air again, and Trey shifted her attention back to her daughter, the smile on her face now a little more at ease, a little less guarded. She was starting to let herself be in this moment, to be present with the life they were building. Daniel didn't want to break the silence, so he stayed where he was, letting the moment stretch out between them. He didn't have to say anything more. They both knew what this was, what it meant. It was a new beginning. It was a chance to be human again, to live without fear, to rebuild after the storm. After a while, Trey looked up at him again, her eyes clearer now, as if the weight of her past had begun to lift, even if just slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, sincere. Daniel simply nodded. He didn't need her to thank him. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he was helping her more, or if she was helping him. She had brought him back to life in ways he hadn't expected, showed him what it meant to care for someone beyond the confines of his own world, beyond the small life he had once built in silence. She had given him a reason to hope again, to believe that there was more to life than just surviving. Trey took a deep breath, turning her attention back to Ravi as the baby reached for a flower, her little fingers closing around the petals. For the first time in months, Trey didn't flinch. She didn't jump at every noise, didn't look over her shoulder every few seconds to see who might be watching. She was just here, and so was Daniel. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead still held its dangers. But in that moment, in the soft glow of the evening, surrounded by the warmth of new life and new hope, Daniel allowed himself to believe in something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for years, that they were going to be okay, together, and that for now was enough. A transformation in itself, one he hadn't expected but was grateful for every day. Trey had shed layers of caution, of self-preservation, and allowed herself to open up just a little at a time. It wasn't easy for her, he knew that. The years of hiding, of surviving, had made her wary, but she was starting to believe in the possibility of something different. In the gentle moments they shared, like the one now, with Ravi in his arms and her gaze warm and unguarded, he saw how much that mattered. Daniel adjusted Ravi in his arms, careful not to disrupt the baby as she reached up to touch his face, her tiny fingers brushing against his skin with innocent curiosity. He laughed softly, his heart filling with tenderness at her sweet expression. "Think she'll remember any of this?" Daniel asked, his voice low, his eyes focused on Ravi, who was now fascinated by his features as if they were the most intriguing thing in the world. Trey's smile faltered slightly, a shadow passing over her features, but it was quickly replaced with something more resigned. She shook her head. "Number. She's too young." Her voice was soft, but there was a trace of sorrow beneath her words, the quiet realization that Ravi would never know the weight of the fear they had carried together. She would never remember the cold nights spent running, the desperation of hiding in places no child should have to hide. Daniel exhaled in relief. The idea that Ravi would grow up without the scars of that life, that she would never have to carry the trauma of the years they had survived, was something he hadn't fully let himself hope for. She would grow up in a world where the horizon wasn't always a reminder of what they had fled. She would have a future free from the war that had torn everything apart. That, more than anything, was the gift he hoped for her. Trey shifted closer, her movements fluid and practiced as she adjusted Ravi's blanket, ensuring the baby was comfortably nestled in the crook of Daniel's arm. The little one gave a soft sigh, content and peaceful in her mother's presence. Trey's gaze lingered on Ravi for a moment longer, her eyes soft with something that, for the first time, looked like pure contentment. She looked up at him then, her golden eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. The tension that had once clung to her shoulders, that had kept her body coiled tight with readiness for the worst, had finally begun to ease. There was a softness there now, a gentleness in the way she held herself, in the way she interacted with Ravi, in the way she allowed herself to trust him. She wasn't just surviving anymore, neither of them were. "This," she said quietly, almost to herself, as she ran a hand over Ravi's tiny fingers. "This is all I ever wanted for her, a chance to live without fear." Daniel watched her, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. He could hear the truth in her voice, the longing that had always been there, buried beneath the surface. She had carried that burden for so long, had lived with the weight of it pressing on her every decision, every action. She had never allowed herself to hope for more than survival. But now, in this quiet moment, there was something else, something bigger, something deeper. It was the hope that her daughter's life could be different, that Ravi would grow up in a world where there was peace, where there was joy. Daniel nodded slowly, his hand brushing against hers, where it rested on Ravi's back. He didn't have the answers to all of her questions. They both knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in months, he felt like they were moving. They were moving towards something better. They were no longer running, no longer hiding. They were finally living. "You've given her that," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady. "You've given her a chance at life, a chance at something more." Trey glanced up at him then, her gaze filled with something trust. It was fragile, like the most delicate thing in the world, but it was there. And in that moment, Daniel realized how much he had grown in the time they had spent together. He hadn't just offered his home to them. He had shared in their journey, had become part of it in a way he hadn't expected. In the silence that followed, he felt the weight of that connection, the understanding that no matter what happened, they were no longer alone. Trey looked down at Ravi, her fingers brushing through the baby's soft hair as she continued to rock her gently. There was no rush now, There was no urgency to move, to keep fighting. For the first time in a long time, they had the luxury of just being, just existing in this space, in this moment, without the looming threat of what might happen next. The quiet between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, one that felt like an unspoken understanding, the kind of silence that spoke of peace, of connection. They didn't need to fill it with words. They had already said everything they needed to. Daniel stayed where he was, standing slightly to the side, watching Trey and Ravi. He knew their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still unknowns, still dangers lurking in the corners of the world. But in that moment, standing there with them, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth fighting for. Not just survival, but life. Not just fear, but the possibility of something better. "Where do we go from here?" Trey asked after a while, her voice soft as she turned her gaze to the horizon. Daniel considered the question for a long moment. He could have easily given her a practical answer, somewhere to go, something to do, a path to follow. But the truth was, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to have a set plan. They would take it one step at a time, just like they had always done. But now, at least, they were taking it together. "We keep moving forward," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Wherever that takes us." Trey nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. The weight of her past had not vanished, but in the light of the new day, she had a chance to forge a different path. A path that wasn't defined by fear and running. A path where she and Ravi could finally have the life they deserved. And for the first time, Daniel didn't just believe in that for them. He believed it for himself, too. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers again, the breeze cool against his face, as the twin suns continued their slow climb in the sky. The world for once felt peaceful. And in that moment, as he stood beside Trey and Ravi, Daniel realized something important. The world didn't have to be perfect to be worth living in. Sometimes it was enough to have each other. And that was everything.